I'd like to go ahead and take just a minute to talk a little bit about some of the immigration patterns to the United States in the late 1800s, mid to late 1800s, again, following the Civil War prior to the turn of the century, and even up to the turn of the century. The immigrants come from all over the place. A lot of them, in fact, probably most of them, really come from Europe. Countries like Italy, countries like Russia and Austria-Hungary, a fair number of immigrants from Germany, and then Ireland and Great Britain. And they come for a multitude of reasons. They come because some of them are fleeing religious persecution, Jews from Russia especially. Some are looking for greater opportunity. They've um, the land has been bought up in the countries they're from, and so there's not as much opportunity to own your own land. There's a plentiful opportunity for that in the United States with things like the Homestead Act of 1862. And some are fleeing political disturbances, the Russian Revolution, 1917, different things like that. So again, there's a whole host of reasons why these immigrants come, especially from Europe. Um, but for one reason or another, we end up with a lot of waves of immigrants coming to this country. But not only from Europe, we also have immigrants coming from China. Some, again, seeking greater economic opportunity. That's a common theme. The gold rush of 1851 and the gold rush again of 1883 in California brings a lot of people to the West Coast from Asia. Also, the Transcontinental Railroad. The Transcontinental Railroad, we have one railroad coming from the east working its way west. Those are mostly Irishmen working on that. But the railroad coming from the west to the east, going through the Rocky Mountains, a lot of the immigrants who built that railroad were Chinese, and they came to work on the Transcontinental Railroad. We also get a fair number of immigrants coming from Japan. Japan was going through economic difficulties at this time. They were just coming out of their period of isolation, and they could earn higher wages in the U.S., working in the fields of places like Hawaii. So the Hawaiian planters began hiring Japanese in large numbers. And so we end up with a fair number of Japanese, again, especially on the West Coast, especially in Hawaii, um, which would make sense. You wouldn't expect to see as many on the East Coast. We also get immigrants coming from Latin America. This would be in the modern southwestern United States, places like Texas, um, as a result of things like the Mexican-American War, and also folks from the West Indies who would also be considered Latin American coming to the United States, particularly the southern United States. The immigrants faced a lot of trials. A lot of the European immigrants show up at a place called Ellis Island in New York City. 16 million immigrants from 1892 to 1943. So a lot of immigrants coming through there, and a lot of them with nothing, and having to enter into New York and try to make a better life with really nothing more than the shirt on their back in many cases. There was an equivalent out on the western coast, again, a point of entry for many, many immigrants coming here. It was called Angel Island. It was located in San Francisco, and for over about a 30-year period, we have about 50,000 Chinese that immigrate through Angel Island. So you can see, again, a large number of people, but again, not to the extent of the 16 million coming from Europe during a similar time period. So the rate not nearly as quick in the West as it was in the East. A lot of the struggles that the immigrants went through revolved around culture shock. There were so many things that were so different here in the United States from what they were used to, and this everything from customs to food we ate, to how children treated parents. All of that stuff was different here in the United States, and really it was a struggle for the immigrants to adapt. It was also a struggle for the people who were already here. The people who were already here didn't always welcome the immigrants, despite what the Statue of Liberty says, to give us your tired, your poor, your huddled masses. A lot of folks who were already here saw the immigrants as a threat to their way of life. The immigrants coming in, changing the culture, taking all the jobs that people who might be eligible for otherwise. And this is a common theme throughout U.S. history, even till this day, fears with regards to immigration. And because of that, you get legislation passed, such as the Chinese Exclusion Act, passed in 1892. It excludes all Chinese immigrants up until 1943. There's only a couple of exceptions to that. We do allow exceptions if we need people to teach Chinese, or the teachers were allowed to immigrate over. If somebody's coming here to be a student, they want to come to a university here in the United States from overseas, we would go ahead and allow that type of immigration. Obviously, if you were a representative of the Chinese government, you would be allowed to live in the United and work in the United States. So we would allow immigrants for those reasons, and we did allow tourists in. Again, tourists today, if you want to come, you're allowed to stay basically for 6 weeks on a tourist visa, and that was the same back then. If you wanted to come to vacation here, we were more than willing for that. We had a similar response to the Japanese as the Chinese, but the Japanese response to us was much different. When we went ahead and started to pass laws that were intended to dissuade or discourage immigrants from Japan, or to treat Japanese immigrants differently. For instance, we segregated schools in San Francisco based on race. This prompted riots back in Japan, and the Japanese were insulted, and they wanted their government to go and take care of these Japanese nationals who were overseas. And so, like I said, riots throughout the country, and we respond. Um, and so we go ahead and we sit down with the Japanese and we say, hey, look, here's the deal. We're worried about the number of Japanese coming in. And so the Japanese, rather than us putting a number on the number of Japanese allowed in, as we did with the Chinese Exclusion Act, where we basically just shut it down, the Japanese say, hey, tell you what, we'll limit it on our end. We'll make sure not so many leave. And so you'll have a slower stream of immigrants coming from Japan. And we were amenable to that. We accepted that agreement. And again, it was a gentleman's agreement in the sense that it was never really written. It was kind of a handshake. They said they would do it. We said, okay. And they did. And we honored that too. And we got rid of the laws about segregation in San Francisco and the things that the Japanese, and so we treated the Japanese differently than we did the Chinese.